Hi. So we have done a number of things already. The first thing that we did was that we installed ngrok and we got it running, and we started our tunnel. So now we have a publicly accessible URL that takes us to port 5000 on our desktop. The next thing that we did was we went ahead and registered our application. Notice that we didn't have any code in place yet or anything. All we needed was to know what our URLs were going to be. And once we did that, we then cloned the repository locally to our desktop, and we went ahead and configured it mostly. So we mentioned the deployment ID, and so the next thing that we really need to do is go ahead into our Learn instance. In this case, I'm using devcon.blackboard.com, and you'll need to make sure you have administrator privileges. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Admin, and we need to actually go ahead and register a couple of things. And for both of these, we're only going to need our client ID. So let's go ahead and we will get our application ID, which is our client ID. And we'll go back into our admin panel and we'll hit LTI tool providers. So I'm going to click register LTI 1.3 tool, and I'm going to go ahead and paste my client ID or my application ID and click submit. And so this has gone out to the developer portal and pulled back all the information that we just specified when we registered our application. So you'll notice here we have our deployment ID. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that before I forget. Now the rest of this is not able to be edited through Learn. That's because this is something that is defined by the developer. So a developer can go into the developer portal and edit this information. For instance, if you need to add another domain, or you change your redirect URL, or you add a new redirect URL. And when that happens, then the end user will have to go and delete this registration and re-register, which means the deployment ID will change. So something to keep in mind as you're rolling through, not just with Ultra Extension Framework, but also with LTI. So basically everything's set up for me. I'm going to go ahead and click approved, and all of this stuff is good to go, and click submit. And so now my UEF tutorial application is registered. And so now we are ready to go on to the next step. And so here you see DevCon 20 UEF Hello World. That is my tool. No, it's not. Here where you see UEF tutorial. That is my tool. And so we are going to do something really quickly, and that is we're going to go in and manage placements, and we're going to create a placement, and we are just going to call it UEF LTI Hello World, and we'll give it a handle. We'll say UEF LTI Hello World. And that does need to be unique. It'll yell at you if it's not. And for this, we're just going to make it a course content tool. And so we'll put in our tool provider URL, and to do this, we are going to go back here and get our link and come back here, paste it, and then we're going to add launch. Now remember, when we registered this, we had to put the trailing slash, and we definitely need to do that here. So we'll go ahead and click submit, and now we have our placement. The next step is to go back to the administrator panel, and we're going to go ahead and register our REST application as well. Now in this LTI application, we're doing something you don't always have to do with LTI, and that is we're calling back and we're doing a three-legged OAuth authentication to get a REST token on behalf of this user. As I mentioned, you don't necessarily have to do this for an LTI tool, but you do have to do this for an Ultra Extension Framework tool. And so I didn't want to get into the whole adding of this and make it a little bit more complicated than it had to be for the purposes of a tutorial. But just know that that is a requirement of Ultra Extension Framework and not a requirement of REST. So we'll go ahead and create our integration. We'll go ahead and go back to our application ID, and we will paste that here, and then we will do what we're never supposed to do and And actually, we don't have to do this because we're using three-legged OAuth. So we'll add it to my normal, regular old staff login. We set up end user access and authorize to act as user. We're going to go ahead and set this to yes now. And the reason that we're doing that is with UEF, this will need to be set to yes, because what this does is it bypasses that authorization screen that you go through with three-legged OAuth. Again, with an LTI tool, if you happen to be doing three-legged OAuth, you would leave this at service default no, and that would force the first time the user logs into your application and uses three-legged OAuth, they have to click a checkbox that says, yes, I authorize this application to act on my behalf. And that's super important when you're using three-legged OAuth. But with Ultra Extension Framework, there is no front end when this this endpoint is called. And so we're going to go ahead and set that to yes. So go ahead and submit. And now we have our tutorial all set up and ready to go. Here we have UEF tutorial. And so now the last remaining thing that we need to do is go back to our LTI tool provider, and we're going to edit, and because I've used copy and paste, I'm going to recopy the deployment ID and click cancel. And now let's go back here to our code, and I'm just going to replace this deployment ID with the one we just created and save it. Okay, so we've completed this step. The next step is going to be getting Docker Desktop installed and running, and then the final step for us to get ready to go is going to be creating our Docker image, deploying it so that it shows up on localhost 5000 and therefore our ngrok endpoint. And then we will be all set to begin the actual work of taking this LTI tool and creating an Ultra Extension Framework integration.